One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. Yes, I'm talking to you. Do you see? Yeah, okay. So are you looking to start a podcast, but you're thinking, I don't know what I'd talk about. Like, I have no idea even where to get started. Don't even let that thought overwhelm you, because guess what? I've done all the work for you. I've actually created a workbook that has 500 podcast ideas for any industry. That's right, 500. Actually, it's over 500. I think it's like 554 for any kind of podcast. I specifically created this tool for entrepreneurs who aren't sure if podcasting is right for them. They say, well, I have a blank, insert any kind of industry, business. Will a podcast work for me? My answer, 99.99999% of the time, is yes, a podcast will totally work for that kind of business. So let's say you're in personal finance or real estate or business or marketing or technology or beauty and fashion or pet services or life coaching or parenting or any other number of industries. I've got you covered. Let me show you some podcast ideas that I have for you to get started. You can go to crystalprofit.com/500 podcast ideas. That's Crystal with a K, Profit with 2 F's and 2 T's. crystalprofit.com/500 podcast ideas. And you can grab this free, 100% free download today.
Okay, guys, I try new things every once in a while because I really like to mix things up. But I don't like to try new things and tell you to try them unless I do them first. Does that make sense? Like, I don't want to start endorsing something and telling you, hey, you really got to go do this if I haven't done it myself. Today is an example of me doing something Actually, it's kind of like the trial and error, right? Like me going forth, making the mistakes so you don't have to kind of thing. And this is a perfect example of something I think that you should start implementing immediately. And I did today's podcast interview on a Facebook Live, and it was so fantastic. It was in my free Facebook group for the Profit Podcast online community, and it was all about podcast ads. And it was fantastic. And I cannot wait to dig into this interview because it was so good. There were so many nuggets of wisdom, and we are unveiling like so many things that I wish I would have known in the first few months of podcasting that I did not understand, really, let's be honest, until probably the last 6 months. I've really fully understood more about the podcast advertising world, how it works, and just all the questions. We answered so many questions in this interview today. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of podcasting, think of this show as the time-saving shortcut you've been looking for. So let's get right to it, shall we? So like I said in the beginning, today's podcast episode was originally recorded as a Facebook Live that I later converted into a podcast episode. And I recently did a YouTube video on how I did everything, what tools I used, and all the things. So I'll link to that in the show notes. But I want to tell you more about today's guest because Anthony Savelli is the co-founder and chief revenue officer at Podcast Ad Reps. And Anthony and I met at the Spark Christian Podcast Conference in February of 2020. And we kind of hit it off and we started chatting about what his company does and how it works with brands and podcasters. And I knew from the moment that we met, I was like, man, I've got to pick his brain on how everything works, because I knew in theory and from working with other organizations like ASA, we've talked about them on the podcast before, but I really wanted to understand what their company did that was different. So Anthony has rapidly established himself as a highly reliable sales professional to the top echelon of podcast advertising agencies. He's tightly connected to the top ad buyers and agency planning strategist, and is an expert at building successful podcast marketing campaigns for brand partners. And I asked so many questions, and I just got to tell you a little bit of the backstory. We kind of talk about this, but this was not our very first podcast interview. We did one at the beginning of all the COVID crisis and whenever all that started. And I think that's when Zoom was really starting to hit like the apex of all of their issues with so many people coming. So Anthony and I originally did our interview and it got lost. It got totally messed up. So I wanted to share that just to kind of give you some transparency that just because I've been doing this doesn't mean that mistakes don't happen and that sometimes you lose audio files. But Anthony was such a sport to come on and do a Facebook Live with me, and I'm just not going to wait any longer. Here is my interview with Anthony from Podcast Ad Reps. Well, hello, everybody. I hope that you're having a fantastic day. I'm really excited because today we have a special guest. And I wanted to give y'all a little bit of the backstory behind our special guest today. So, Anthony is somebody that I actually met at the Spark Christian Podcast Conference back in February of 2020, when we could still all gather around and be social with people, right? Like none of the things that are happening right now in the world were happening. And we did this interview already. I feel like this is a deja vu Groundhog Day situation because we did this interview about a month ago. And then this was right when everything happened and Zoom malfunctioned. So like keeping it real, you guys, like giving y'all the behind the scenes of what happened. And I lost our interview. And I've been like on like trying to just hound tech support and say, please, we got to figure this out, like all the things. But I'm so excited that Anthony decided to come on today here in our group and do this Facebook Live, because I think that the conversation is going to be even deeper and richer than it was the first time, because I have more questions, which I'm sure he's like, oh, great. Because I have so many questions about all the things podcast advertising. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on our guest, Anthony. So welcome, Anthony. How are you? Let me get us set up here.
What's up, Crystal? How are you? Thanks for having me back on.
Yes. I'm so glad that this worked out. I know that there are several people that were like, I can't do it, when you're going to be live, but they're definitely going to come back and watch the replay of our whole conversation because so many people want to know about podcast advertising. So I just really want to, like I said, kind of have like a Groundhog Day situation on some of the things we'll probably cover again, but I do have some new questions. But can we just get started with how did you find yourself in the world of podcast advertising and all the things that you do?
Yeah, so it's always a long story, but I'll try and keep it short. I never thought I would be in the podcast advertising industry, but I did always have somewhat of a passion for sales and communication. And I wound up in a bit of a management role at a truck manufacturing plant for Peterbilt just out of college. And I wasn't feeling super fulfilled doing that. And long story short, I did a job search on LinkedIn, and I had a connection that had posted a gig for podcast sales, like a national accounts manager type role. And I took it and did some quick training, and that's how I entered the space. It was a sales role at a podcast network that was pretty much a tech platform focused on booking campaigns on podcasts. So that's how I was introduced to the space.
That's so crazy. So, and how long ago was what is the timeline of how all of this kind of played out?
Sure. So that was 3 years ago, and I joined a company called Cast Plus, and I was only there for about 7 months until the company went out of business. And my old boss and I figured out how to kind of we figured we would try and do something ourselves because it's such a new space, and there's so much opportunity, and we found that there were so many independent podcasters seeking vendors, people to help them monetize. And we kind of knew we had a solution for that, and we worked really well together. So we decided to launch Podcast Ad Reps.
That's so cool.
That was 3 years ago. So
that's so awesome. Yeah. I mean, because I feel like I've been having several conversations with other people that they don't necessarily just do podcasting. They're not as geeky about podcasting as I am, but they've been in the space for maybe a year or two. And they're like, I feel like I've been doing this for so long because so much has changed in this short amount of time. So what has been the number one trend or thing that you've seen change since you've been in this space?
Sure. I would say as of late, aside from what's happening with the coronavirus, which has definitely had an effect on our industry, I think that things are becoming more regulated in general. There's a lot of discussions about attribution and providing more campaign tracking and analytics. It pretty much publicizes the kind of the private numbers that podcasters see, specific downloads. There's just a structure, things are becoming more structured between ad agencies, clients, and podcasters and networks. So it's good, and I would say it's good really in general. So yeah, it's change. Change is always tough, so you have to adapt, and that's what podcasting is such a new and exciting industry, and we have to be able to adapt and change with the times.
Yes, that's so interesting because, I don't know if it was released this week or it was the first time I heard about it, but, Google has their whole Google Manager or whatever they're doing on their side. So I feel like all of these, Spotify coming onto the scene, there's a lot of dollars, big dollars being thrown into the podcasting space. So from an advertising standpoint, most of the people that are going to watch this and listen to this, they are thinking, I'm not going to have millions of downloads. I'm hoping to just hit, a few thousand in a first year of my podcast. So to those, us indie podcasters that are really just trying to get out there, there is still a piece of the advertising pie for us to have. So what would be a piece of advice that you would give to someone who's just starting out and they know that they have a super niche topic that probably won't bring in something like a Joe Rogan downloads or any, I mean, he's kind of a unicorn anyway. Like, let's just be honest. Like he's
No
definitely
doubt.
a unicorn in this space. But for someone who has a smaller following, a smaller listener base, what advice would you give to them?
So I would say you need to define who your P1 listener is. Who is your primary target? Who's going to be tuning in and listening to your content and embracing it, and just tune in week to week? Who's going to be the most engaged with you? Is that a female, or a male? Is it someone who's young, a millennial, or is it somebody who's on the older end? What's the target male female skew, and what's your age demographic looking like? Those are really good things to define when you begin looking for advertisers. And moving forward from there, what would their interests be? Is it someone that likes to spend time outside? Someone who's into sports? Is it somebody who focuses on health and wellness and uses all sorts of skincare products, hair products, stuff like that? It's really good to define what your target is and what their interests are before you can begin to seek out who might make sense from an advertiser standpoint. So that's just kind of looking at it generally. What kinds of brands should I target? But the other question is where are you going to look? From the indie standpoint, and when your audience isn't necessarily like a Joe Rogan of sorts, it's sometimes best to look local. Who can you help in your area, and who might be interested in using your audience to spread the word about their products. It's sometimes a bit more difficult to seek out big national advertisers like a ZipRecruiter or a ShipStation to advertise on a smaller audience. They're looking for giant, large-scale digital campaigns, and they're looking for Joe Rogan type shows and those millions and hundreds of thousands of impressions. So I'd say look more local. But that doesn't mean you don't have opportunities with national clients. There's other types of campaigns. We call them CPA deals or like affiliate deals, where what that stands for is a cost per action. So it kind of comes at a more limited cost to the advertiser. They're not necessarily spending money to have a presence on a show, but you have the ability to make money and drive some revenue by driving conversions. So the way that works is if you advertise for any given mattress company, let's say, I've heard that mattress companies give between a 20 and 25% commission split whenever a conversion is driven. So we're talking about conversions that are typically around $1,200 to $1,400. So, if you sell a few mattresses from giving a read to an audience of 500 to a couple thousand people, you could make some pretty good money doing that. It would just be right. So there's definitely routes to go local or national from an independent standpoint. It's just a little bit different picture than the Joe Rogans and large scale audiences.
Right. Well, I'm sitting here. When I hear you say local, I'm thinking of geographical regions, and we live in Texas, and I'm like, Texas is huge. So what would you consider local? Is that like at the state level, or are you talking about like within your county, within your city? Like what do you consider local?
So I say local, but really what I mean is places that you're very familiar with, that you might have a personal tie to. Let's say there's a place nearby that has soaps, something like that, and you think you have a health and wellness type podcast. If they're shipping their product out to customers and they're looking to advertise on platforms like yours, it might come at an efficient cost to test out and see how it works out. If you offer 15% off or 20% off a bar of soap or a soap package, something like that, they might be more inclined. If it's just you selling the podcast yourself, that might be a good place to start, is, just those good, what makes sense for your target audience locally and that you're aware of and have a connection to.
Yeah. Well, I love the in-depth, like, cause I tell everybody, I was like, you have to understand your listener. And I love that we're taking this approach too, because it makes your audience more appealing, not just for you, because it'll make you as a podcaster, creating content will be a lot easier. You'll really understand what they want. But also, if you do plan to monetize your show in ways, I mean, I know a lot of people watching and listening are like, well, I'm going to have my own products and my own services. Okay, that's fantastic. But I also do think that we should explore the world of like what is out there for podcast advertising. Like maybe, a lot of people are saying, maybe I can look at this in 6 months to a year once I've gotten my podcast off the ground, but I like the idea of keeping it super niche and super focused. But I want to switch gears for a second because I know like the thought on everybody's mind is like, okay, Anthony, tell us what's the secret? What's the magic number that we have to have in order to even think that our podcast could be in the ballpark of being ready to advertise? So what would you say to someone that's thinking that?
Well, that definitely depends. So I've heard of podcasters monetize with as little as 50 listeners or less, maybe. That's where that cost per action type deal can come into play. It's how willing are you to put an advertisement in your episode, and these ads can be seen as a nuisance, but they can also be valuable to listeners. At what point is it worth it to you to start advertising? Most campaigns that I work on with the national advertisers and larger shows, the cost is built on a CPM model. So that's a cost per 1,000 listeners. So for my clients, typically, if you've got a couple thousand listeners and you're willing to integrate an ad on your episode at a cost of about $50, after commission, you're looking at somewhere between like $30, $40, something like that. Is it worth it to you to interrupt the content with an ad like that? It might not be. Some people, it might cover the costs and really make the whole project sustainable. So I would say for national advertisers, it definitely depends. But from a network standpoint, I would say it's between 5,000 and 10,000 listeners is probably a good starting point if you're looking to go with the big national agency and clients. But from an indie standpoint, you can start with as little as 50 listeners or, even less than that. Sometimes it just depends on what route you want to take to monetize.
I love that because I feel like everybody that's listening, like their shoulders just kind of relax, like, oh, this is possible. Like this could actually happen for me, which is why I wanted to have this conversation. Cause I feel like there's a lot of stigmas about like, there's like behind the scenes, like no one can know, like it's between the brands and like, people at your level and what y'all do to work with podcasters and brands. I feel like it's been this big mystery. And that's been my interpretation of everything I've tried to find online. There's a lot of barriers to find information. But like you said earlier, the stats are becoming more available for everyone to see. So I think that maybe some people were kind of fluffing up their numbers for a long time because that the stats weren't out there for everyone to see. And now you still, you couldn't just go and look at all of my numbers, but there are some tools out there now where people can see, oh, you say you have a top rated podcast, but do you really? So from that standpoint, like because I'm imagining my listeners and my audience, like they're scrappy entrepreneurs and they want to get started with really growing their show. They want to just get out there and know their listeners and understand them better. But I'm trying to remember, you told me about a client that you had. She was, I just remember it was a woman and it was like a bra company or a lingerie company or something. But I just remember you said something really important about how specific it was. Do you remember that part of our conversation? I'm trying to remember exactly what it was.
I took some notes this time, so I've got a little bit more focused in here. But yeah, I think that I was talking about the Almost 30 podcast. It's a super female skewing health and wellness show, and their relationship with the client, Third Love. It's a bra company. And I think that conversation started when we were talking about like the actual benefits of podcast advertising and why it shouldn't necessarily be considered a necessary evil, which it is to a lot of people considered a necessary evil. It's I need to make money, but I don't want to sell out and have ads on it. The way that I see it, when you format campaigns correctly, the campaign should benefit not just the client. They're not going to be the only ones making money, but it should benefit all parties involved. And to me, that means the client, they have a solid return on investment. They're making a profit or they're spreading the word that kind of gives them some residual income down the line. The network and the host, and I'll kind of squeeze us in there as a vendor. They make a little commission cut that keeps business sustainable. And the audience, they get access to an applicable product. They get a solid discount code, and they maybe learn about something they didn't know before that could benefit them, and they get it at a nice rate. So when formatting campaigns correctly, everybody wins. And a couple examples I talked to you about last time, it was Third Love and Almost 30, and a couple other clients that they might work with that make more sense. It's feminine healthcare, like brands like Lola or Hum Nutrition or Liquid IV, hydration, skincare, hair care. Those are clients that, in my opinion, benefit all parties involved. So I think that's the example we talked about last time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really wanted to get everybody to like have a mental picture of like a line where like everyone is level and everyone benefits in the entire situation, because I think that a lot of people do see it as selling out whenever they don't feel good about it, because they're like, I have to monetize this. I got to make money doing this, but I got to sell out. Like, that's really what they feel like. I got to sell out, and I got to have mattress ads or something like dog food whenever I'm a cat person, or, whatever. Like, they feel like they're selling out in some way. So I just wanted to really hone in on the fact that if you do it correctly, like you said, running a campaign where everybody benefits, it's a pretty enjoyable experience. I would assume that it's like more brands that are like that would see it as, oh, that's an opportunity to advertise there. So do you see that as the case? Like, usually if a campaign performs well with one podcast, that other companies are like, oh, we want to get on board with that?
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, many clients that spend money in podcasting come from the same kind of buying agencies. So they see a relationship that makes a lot of sense on a podcast that they haven't bought on for their client. They'll see that performance and think, I should test this audience with my client too. Maybe it's working for them, so maybe it'll work for mine too. So when you see performance, usually you kind of see a dogpiling of sort on those shows. And performance, it's kind of hard to define what that means. I know that might be a big question for people that aren't familiar with advertising. So there are a lot of metrics that agencies use to rank how a campaign performs and whether it makes sense to renew or to back off the show. And that's typically, it's a CPA, that's the metric. It's cost per acquisition. So it's basically a virtual measurement of marketing success, and it measures like the aggregate cost to acquire a paying customer on a campaign, there's like math that goes into it. And that's like the campaign cost divided by the amount of conversions on a promo code. And that's the result is your CPA. So you always hear clients talking about goal and whether something's making goal or not. And when something is hitting goal, that means that it's successful and they want to partner on a deeper level, which comes from an annual renewal, something, a long-term campaign and a more deep partnership with the podcast.
I'm learning so much from you. Like, I so appreciate this conversation just because I've heard a lot of these terms, and like, even just, CPA and like the whole CPM, like I had heard these terms getting thrown around, but not really explained in an in-depth level. And now that you say it like that, it's like, it's not so scary. Like, it makes sense, which is why I wanted to have this conversation. Cause I feel like brand new baby podcasters, they kind of get thrown into the deep end of some of these things, and they see these terms and everything getting thrown around. And I want them to know it's not scary. It's just something that we just need to have it explained to us in a way that makes sense. That way, whenever someone does get an opportunity to work with a brand, work with a company where, someone like y'all, like you approach someone and like, hey, I think that this could be fantastic. They're not so like, whoa, I don't want to do that because I'm selling out. Because I think that that's kind of the impression that some podcasters get. But I see that we have a question, so I want to address this real fast. It says, what happens if you have a huge number of downloads on one or two episodes and a decent amount on all the others? It seems like you have to be a big fish or you're relegated to CPA affiliate codes. Any advertisers looking for the equivalent of micro influencers in the podcasting world? So can you kind of speak to that?
Sure. Well, when we bring audience numbers to market, it's typically an average. So you're going to see episodes that spike, and a lot of that's based on the topic for the episode or maybe a special guest that jumps on. So it's hard to base your average on those numbers. However, those numbers are going to, in general, bring your total average up. So it's excellent and a big one for an advertiser to have a huge number of downloads. And that is going to benefit you if you have a cost per action type campaign on the show where you have more people listening to it. So you have a higher chance of having more conversions, and effectively you'll make more commission on more sales. But when you're doing more brand awareness or standard DR marketing, kind of what we were talking about with how they measure success using promo codes, stuff like that, you're going to typically base that on your average downloads on any given episode, not those spike numbers. But those are really, obviously it's good to see. It's going to build your audience as a whole, and it gives you an idea of the potential for your show.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And I think it's just important to kind of look at it that way, because I could see where you're like, you get really excited because you're like, oh, I landed this big guest and then I'm going to get a spike. But then you're like, but what does this mean? Like, is this good? I mean, but like you said, it's going to raise all of your other averages. Everything else is just going to increase. And hopefully you get more big guests like that and continue to have, even more success over the life of your podcast. But I wanted to ask more about, because I know that we did talk about this last time, because like I said, most listeners are going to be within the first year, basically, of their show. So are advertisers looking at the longevity of a show? Like how long, if it's been around for 4 years or 5 years, does that play into it? Or what if someone that has been an influencer on another platform somewhere, then they start podcasting and then it blows up? Like, are they looking more at like the reliable track record? Or if this happened for someone that's in their first year, like what would you say to them?
It totally depends. So as you said before, we're talking about influencers. Some networks will pay a very famous influencer to come on and launch a seasonal show that is going to have a certain number of impressions. It's going to go right out of the gates being super hot and super attractive to national advertisers. So that does happen. That you can have a really short time frame for you can pre-sell shows. Actually, if it's something that's going to launch in a few months, you're selling it. You might even have an option. Something happen where a show sells out before it even goes live on the air. So that happens with the big national clients and big networks, stuff like So longevity is very good though for independent podcasters, and it really goes to build a more organically grown and highly engaged audience. I love working with independent podcasters for that reason. Your level of engagement is typically a lot right. higher than it is with a influencer that's got a just kind of a random show that they kind of made up just based on the influencer right. themselves. So I would say that the amount of time a show has been on air does come into consideration when you're talking and negotiating with clients, but it's definitely not make or break. It's going to be based on your average listenership for the most part. So whether you've been live for 1 year or 10 years, it's most of the time based on just your average listenership.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. And I love that we keep using like, it depends. It's variable, because it's so true. Like, I mean, I could think of so many different podcasts out there that have a very broad topic, but the person speaking, like everyone wants to learn from that one person, but then there's other people that are super narrow, super focused. And I'm sure their audience is crazily engaged with everything that they're talking about. So I totally agree. I think it just depends on what you're doing, who your audience is. And I'm glad that we keep reiterating this point because it just makes your marketing easier and everything else like that. But I have a question about the logistics with you have a podcast, you have a brand, and then you have a company like yours. And have we said your company name yet? Yeah, the Podcast Ad Reps. Have we said
Podcast
that? Yeah.
ad reps.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Shout out Podcast Ad Reps. But whenever, so are y'all really just brokering the deal? Are y'all making sure that it works? Like, how is it that does a podcaster work with directly you and then y'all work with the brand to figure out a contract? How does all that work?
So we're partnered with independent podcasts and network podcasts. And we usually, word travels pretty quick in our small podcasting community. Well, it's not so small anymore, but word travels fast for sure. And, when you're effective in building campaigns and revenues for one show, others are going to hear about it and reach out. So that's kind of how we've created our catalog. We do broker deals. We do negotiate them between clients and shows. We have like a lot of contacts on the client side. So we're able to virtually create streams of revenue overnight for some podcasts. We've used health and wellness as an example many times. I know who's spending money on those types of shows. So that's why podcasts will come to us to help them seek out those advertisers. And it's at limited to no cost to the show because we get paid on a commission basis. So, you only eat what you kill. So,
right.
That's kind of, that's the value that we bring is we'll broker deals. We manage campaigns. We make sure everything is structured properly and we're experts at doing that. So, we're more of a sales network, less of like a true network, like a big Wondery type. We're not creating our own content, but we're doing pretty much everything else. And we definitely help shows grow their audiences by partnering. When you have a network, you can find multiple sports podcasts and help them to arrange interviews and cross promote on each other's shows. So we do have efforts where we help grow audiences as well as monetize. But that's our monetization is our main business.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. So I'm thinking about the things that you were saying that align with so much of the things that I teach. And one of them that keeps popping in my head is about the format of a show. So I can imagine y'all have many different kinds, like long podcast, short podcast, daily, weekly, monthly, like I'm sure it just runs the gamut. But I am particularly curious about the performance of where an ad is placed. So can you speak to that? Like, do y'all have any like hard data about a intro ad is going to be better than a mid-roll versus post-roll? Like what do you have to say, or what is your opinion about that?
Yeah, definitely. This is a topic that comes out a lot when talking with podcasters that are just getting introduced to the ad space. There's three kinds of ads that we run in the baked in format on podcasts. And that's the pre-roll, the mid-roll, and the post-roll. 90 to 99% of the time when you're talking to national advertisers, they want a mid-roll read. That's because when you're in the middle of an episode and you're kind of in the middle of content, you take a break, you have the most engaged listenership. So you kind of stop at an important point in the show, take a break for your advertisers, and your listeners are going to be more engaged at that point. Then if you're going live with an ad at the very end, when you've had some listeners tune out pretty much, they've already kind of heard the majority of what you're delivering that day as far as content goes, and they're more inclined to just tune out. Same goes at the beginning during a pre-roll read. Like on the Joe Rogan podcast, I think that a lot of regular listeners have become familiar with the fact that he kind of adds all of his advertisements at the very beginning of the episode. So you can basically skip a certain amount of time and not have to hear any ads. So that's why mid-rolls are the most desirable inventory. They cost the most. That's the best way to monetize. Mid-rolls are the most attractive. I'd say then it goes pre-roll. Pre-rolls can be very effective because most people listen to a podcast from the beginning to end. And post-rolls are probably the more of a remnant type, lower rates, less engaged listenership. But the way that you integrate, it should all be based on what makes the most sense for your show. So if interrupting in the middle of an episode is a serious no, then I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't want to scare off listeners and bring your average amount of listeners down by adding advertisers. But sometimes it does make sense. So
yeah. Well, I like that you said that. It's kind of like keeping the integrity of like the relationship between the host and the listeners. That way you don't really like cross that line, because I mean, I know personally, I've listened to a show and they were like, we'll never have ads. We'll never have ads. We'll never have ads. Then guess what? They showed up one day and they had ads that were totally unrelated to everything that was on the podcast. And I was done. I was just so done. I was betrayed. That's the word I like to use. I was betrayed by this show. I just couldn't listen to it anymore. But I think that we're covering just so many great things that I know everyone that's listening they've already had these questions, because I had these in the first year of my podcast. I was so worried that I was the only person out there in the podcast space that had no idea how any of this worked. But now that I've been doing this for a while and I ask a lot of questions to a lot of my friends that are way smarter than me, I'm like, oh, wait, nobody knows all this stuff unless they start asking about it. So I wanted to really just have this conversation to let everybody know that if you're curious about advertising, Anthony has a fantastic company that works with great brands. And if you find that your podcast is to that point, then I suggest reaching out to them and seeing what could happen with your podcast, because I think that there could be awesome relationships that you form with other brands. I want to read, Shauna made a comment. She says, I'm happy to recommend and share brands that I use. I would not consider that selling out. It's useful to know how to work with those companies. And I love like her input, because that's how I feel too. Whenever I hear something on a podcast and it is 100% aligned with me, like I love The Office Ladies. The Office Ladies podcast is one of my favorites. And so when I hear something on there, I'm like, oh, I want that. I would totally buy that. I totally want it. So I can relate to having that like symbiotic relationship of everybody benefiting from having a great partnership. So I am so appreciative of our conversation today, but I'm going to put you through the ringer again because no one heard your answers last time. Are you up for answering some rapid fire questions, Anthony?
I am, Crystal. I love the best.
Well, now they're not so rapid fire because you've already had them before, so you're a little prepared.
Same questions? All right, I got you.
Yeah, we'll do the same ones. Okay, so we've kind of answered this one already, but I'm going to ask again. What advice would you give to a brand new podcaster?
A brand new podcaster, sales or just in general?
Just in general. If you know someone's starting, they're listening, just from being in the industry, what advice would you give to them?
So I would tell them that engagement is one of the most important things about all podcasting in general. Your engagement with your audience. Don't just think about the podcast. Think about the brand that you're creating. Find your niche. Make sure you release episodes at a set cadence. Establish that day. Establish the time that you want to release your episodes, and keep up with it. That way, you have more listeners tuning in at the same time every week. They know where to access the episode, and they know exactly what time to access. And keep that structure in place. And that's going to drive more listeners that stick around for the long run. And then other than that, really engagement is the word that you hear all the time in podcasting. Engage with your audience. Be accessible, just like you're doing here. Reply to comments, reply to messages. Keep up with your socials and your blogs, and create more of just a whole community surrounding your concept and your content, rather than just a podcast that releases whenever you feel like it should. I would say treat it less like a hobby and more like, I'm making a show and I'm gonna grow it and commit to this thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. That's exactly what I preach. I'm on that for sure. Okay. What is a dream podcast that you would love to be on?
Well, I've got the Rogan poster back here. You can see it. I'm definitely a big fan of the Rogan show. So I would have to say probably Joe Rogan's show, just because he's a great interviewer and he's unbiased, and it's great content and a funny dude. So I'd say the Rogan podcast.
That's awesome. So I'm going to give you my little like tidbit behind this and I'm trying to remember where I heard this from, but I did not realize how much preparation he puts into his show. And I didn't
Mhm.
realize he was a stand-up comedian, like way, way, way. I mean, I know that he's a comedian and all the things, but like way back in the day. And that's why he is so good at being a podcaster. Like, would you agree with that? Like that plays like
Yeah.
a big role into it.
Definitely. I mean, the comedy, his comedian past is definitely really important. And I don't know if you ever watched Fear Factor, but he was the host of
Yes.
Fear Factor. So he's good at kind of moderating. And other than that, he's like in martial arts. So there's a lot of different kind of like the health aspect of it comes into play, and diet, fitness, all that stuff. So it's definitely there's a lot of layers to that show. So it's,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. It's been something really cool to watch, like from like where I sit in the industry. I'm always looking for a good case study. So I'm just like,
Mhm.
man, that's really cool. Okay,
Definitely.
so my next question is, do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
I would say to a certain degree, I am kind of a perfectionist. I like to be super organized. You kind of have to in this business, especially when there's so many lines cast in all sorts of directions. So you do have to be to a certain degree, but I try not to be to a point where it gets like almost toxic, where you're trying to be perfect with everything, and if it's not 100%, then you feel like you failed. So that's when you kind of cross the line, and I try to be somewhere in between perfection. I guess that's kind of my thoughts on being a perfectionist.
Yeah.
It can be good and bad. So,
It's good. It's good. I totally get what you're saying.
mhm.
Okay. And then this is my question just for you, because I know that you don't currently have a podcast. Do you see yourself starting a podcast one day?
Maybe. I mean, I like to talk. That's for sure. So I would love to have a I would love to have a podcast someday. Maybe we'll see. I don't know. I like comedy a lot, so I could see myself having some sort of a show with some buddies, something like maybe a comedy type show, or even just like producing stuff. I like to learn about the kind of technology side of things and production. So, maybe having a podcast by producing one could be an option. So I'd say
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I could see that someday being a thing.
You're open to it. I'm like, what movie is that? So you're telling me there's a chance like that it could possibly happen, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like if the opportunity presented itself, maybe.
Maybe. All right. Well,
Wouldn't
that's
mind
that's
working
good
on that.
enough for me. Like a maybe is good enough as long as it's not a no, because then I'd be like, sorry, like we're done. We're done. Can't be friends anymore if you're gonna say no.
Right.
Anthony, thank you so much for coming on the show today and hanging out with us and really just giving us an education in podcast advertising, because I think it's so important that more people really understand how the system works. That way more people can get in on the action and not kind of hold back and be scared of like this big mystery that is podcast advertising. I want more people to get out there and make some money with their podcast and really do big things. So I so appreciate it. Can you tell everyone where they can find more about your company?
Sure. Yeah, you can learn more about us at podadreps.com. And I know there's not a lot of resources on the web on how to monetize your podcast. So if you ever have any questions, reach out to us. There's a comment section on there. And, we always follow up and love to help people get into the space. We love podcasting. So feel free to reach out. And thank you, Crystal. I really appreciate coming on with you today.
Yeah, this was so helpful. And I know that so many people got just awesome things from this. So thanks again, Anthony.
Excellent. Thanks, Crystal.
Well, what do you think? I hope that you found this episode super helpful because, like I said, it was a fantastic conversation. We had so much fun, and I felt like I could have asked him so many other questions, but I was just like, okay, like we need to wrap this up because I could go on for hours and hours trying to understand how we as podcasters can really get in on the advertising market and use what we have, our content, our audience, our platforms, everything in the most strategic way to really monetize our shows and bring even more value into this world, but also make some money with your podcast. Like I feel like that's going to be my goal over the next 12 months is to understand more about how everything works and to really establish how you can use these tools from the beginning. right? Like if you listen to part of our conversation, it's like, it's not about having a Joe Rogan sized podcast. It's about having the right audience, targeted content, and people that are willing to engage with you and actually do what you ask them to do, whether it's a simple call to action or just doing everyday things that you mentioned within your podcast. But I want all of us to strive super hard to stay engaged with our audience, keep creating awesome content that is focused. Like, I feel like that's like the theme of everything we talked about, was just niching down, getting more specific, and having a very clear picture of who your ideal audience is. That way, when you do get the opportunity or you get to the point where you want to monetize, you could tell a sponsor or an ad rep agency like Anthony's, hey, this is who my listener is. I know them so well. They listen to me, like they actually get me, they engage with me, and they're in this for the long haul. And I'm ready to have a strategic partnership with a brand that can elevate my audience and help them out and add more value. So that's what I got out of today's interview. I hope that you found it just as helpful. I'm planning to do some more interviews just like this, where we take a live action video, live action. It's not like we were, doing stunts and doing all that. I mean, we could, who knows? Maybe we do have something coming up, or we're doing some exercise moves or something. I don't know. That sounds fun, right? But I hope that you enjoyed this interview with Anthony today. Make sure you check out the show notes to find the link to his business. And I'm actually going to link to where you can find our live video if you want to go check that out as well. So go to crystalprofit.com/episode 155 to check out the show notes and see more about podcast ad reps. But that's all I have for you today. So I want you to take a screenshot wherever you're listening to this podcast and tag me and let me know what you thought about this episode. Make sure that you subscribe to the show so you don't miss any future episodes. And remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Crystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Crystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.